Welcome back to this episode of Smart Bridges Podcast, Transform IT. I'm your host, Patrick Pahls, and today we're going to be talking with Paul from Avalara. Now, Paul is the Strategic
Alliance Manager.
Okay, and so Paul, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on who you are?
Sure. So my name is Paul Turec. I'm the Strategic Alliance Manager with Avalara. And essentially what that means is I'm someone who works with great partners like SmartBridge to make sure that you understand what we do as a company, the value that we provide you and your customers, and when it makes sense to introduce us as a solution. And so specifically what Avalara does is we help customers automate their sales tax and their use tax obligations. We give them tools that allow them to automate that process and be able to make sure that they're operating legally in the states in which they have to collect and remit that sales tax.
Okay, so we're in the Oracle's Infocus event, or industry event, I should say, which really focuses mainly on JD Edwards. But the tax software that you talked about, is it specifically for JD Edwards, or is it a more broad spectrum solution?
Yeah, so we're definitely what we'd call a horizontal solution. So we do have a validated integration into JD Edwards Enterprise One, but we actually integrate with over about 600 different platforms. So it's really not uncommon for our customers to have multiple platforms that we assist them with these tax calculations with. So it might be an e-commerce system in addition to their JD Edwards system, or a CPQ system, or a POS system, for example. So if they're doing retail, or they're out in the field doing sales and they need actual hardware that rings up transactions for them, our system will connect to that as well. So really what that does is it gives a client a single point of truth to which all of their platforms can connect to be able to calculate that sales tax obligation.
All right, so noted. Avalara is a one-stop shop for your tax software. Yeah. Now that we have the introduction and the pseudo-shameless plugs out of the way, what I really brought you here in, because since you're a tax software company, taxes is at the forefront of everything that you do. Now, recently there's a landmark case, Wayfair versus South Dakota,
right,
that has some major implications for online retail and enterprises in general. And because you're subject matter experts, I wanted to kind of have you give us a little bit of a rundown on what that means downstream in the next couple of years for both the enterprise and online retailers, and some of the things that we can do to mitigate our risk as we move forward.
Yeah, so South Dakota versus Wayfair was really kind of a landmark case in the sense that retailers, anyone doing any sort of business out of state commerce, it's really landmark in the sense that they have to understand the rules that now affect them, where once it really didn't come into play. And what that rule is the common term is called economic nexus. So just kind of stepping back a little bit, prior to South Dakota versus Wayfair, really the kind of quote unquote law of the land was what was known as North Dakota versus Quill. And so back in, I believe it was 92, what that ruling stated was that you had to have what's called physical presence in order to have nexus in a particular state. Nexus meaning an obligation to, again, collect and remit sales tax. So it could be a warehouse, it could be a sales office, it could be a manufacturing plant. It could even be, in some cases, we're in Denver today for the JD Edwards Infocus Summit. I actually ran a breakout session earlier, and I informed everyone, hey, I hate to tell you, but if you don't do business in Denver right now and you didn't previously have Nexus, there's actually a possibility that you attending this trade show now triggered Nexus. So where before your company wasn't required to collect sales tax, it may in fact have to now. So what the physical presence did was the only way that companies had to collect that sales tax is, again, if all those triggers were taking place. Well, South Dakota versus Wayfair changed all that. So it actually became what's called economic nexus. And so what economic nexus means in the case of South Dakota versus Wayfair, I believe, was $100,000. So essentially, if you do $100,000 in sales to the residents of South Dakota, and you previously did not have physical nexus in that state, due to this ruling and essentially the kind of justification of that rule by South Dakota, that law by South Dakota, you now have to collect and remit sales tax.
Okay, but so that brings up a couple interesting points. From some of the things that I heard, and a lot of the counterpoints in the suit were that this is really going to hurt the small guys, the startups, and the people that really don't do a whole lot of business. They talk about Etsy being one of them, where people can come basically create anything and then sell it online. But you said that it's the $100,000 price point. So honestly, if you're doing $100,000 in South Dakota, you're probably pretty well off, and you can you should probably get your taxes in order, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and and while at Avalara we try not to make any assumptions or any sort of statements that that lean one way or the other, but I think the one thing to think about is that, again, it's a $100,000 threshold. So really, to some degree, I think someone could say that this kind of evens the playing field. So if you're a small mom and pop shop, whereas before, even if you're doing business in the state of South Dakota, but you're having to deal with someone down the street who, instead of coming up to your shop to buy something, instead is buying it on Amazon or any other retailer where previously they didn't have to collect sales tax. And so they bought that online because they saved that 7, 8, 9% in sales tax. That's now been leveled. That playing field has been leveled for those retailers. So I think there's also an argument to be said that while there might be some retailers that are smaller, or like you said, Etsy's, eBay sellers, etc., who might just barely cross that $100,000 threshold, so now they have to deal with this. I think what it does do is help some local retailers to be able to kind of avoid that objection, perhaps, from even local folks who say, well, I'll just buy it on Amazon because it'll save me $10, for example.
Okay, so that's very interesting, and it's one of those things that's always fun. Technology and the law don't always go hand in hand and advance at the same pace. And it's what is it, 92? It's 2018 right now, so this is a relatively old.
Yeah, it took a long time to catch up, really.
But it is good now, and with the rise of online retailer and sales and everything, you think back in 92, what, like 10% of the people had internet and no one was really doing any online sales, and now everyone does it. I mean, I don't think I've met a single person in the past year that hasn't used online retailers in some way, shape, or form. So that is pretty interesting. Now, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. Now that we have some context for what we're talking about, what are the real implications for what would be considered our customers or the enterprise class in itself? So you talked about economic nexus versus the physical nexus. What are some additional, very kind of specific things that those enterprise customers are going to have to deal with? And maybe some suggestions, like I said earlier, about how they could mitigate some risk and actually move forward and not have the tax man get them.
Yeah, so I mean, really what this does is it just creates an entirely new environment where they have to think about their tax obligations. So again, before, they knew where they operated. They knew where they had salespeople. They knew where they had warehouses. They knew where they had activities that they were doing that triggered this nexus. And so now they have to actually look through a different lens in terms of, are we properly collecting sales tax? Are we accounting for those rules? Because when we talk about South Dakota versus Wayfair, it's not just South Dakota. I mean, essentially what that did was it established precedents to where other states who either have laws that are already in place or soon to be laws in place, and there's quite a few of them already. If they're not already in place, it's going to happen later this year for quite a few. I wouldn't be surprised if we see all states that collect sales tax today may eventually move to adopting economic nexus in addition to physical. So what that means is if you're an enterprise level customer and you're doing business across the United States, you need to make sure that you understand your obligations. And whether that's from a tax professional, an accountant that you work with today, or even a solution like Avalara that can provide that sort of counsel in terms of how you need to think about where you should be collecting this tax.
Well, thank you, Paul. That's all the time we have for us today. For all you listeners out there, if you could give us a like and a share wherever you found us, and follow us if you can, we would appreciate it.
Thanks, Patrick, for having me.